Hello! I have a special treat for all of you watching today. You may remember some time ago that I featured a series of videos on this channel by a YouTuber by the name of Colttaine, in which he looks at a variety of statistics that he's managed to dig up from all around the world, cross-references them all with each other, and finds some really interesting patterns in regards to human behavior, the environment that we find ourselves in modern society, and certain points throughout recent history, especially in regards to things like the contraceptive pill. And in that video, I mentioned that I was going to have a follow-up conversation with him in which we'd look at this study that he's put out here. We'd look at the hypotheses presented. We'd talk about some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses, some of the improvements that can be made on this for the future. And I am today joined by the man himself. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce him to you. Hello, Colttaine. How are you doing?
I am fabulous. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. That is a fantastic thing for you to be. So, I've got a few questions about that presentation that you so kindly allowed me to upload onto my channel. So I figured we'd go through some of those first. Some of them are my own invention. Others are little points which I've kind of pulled out of the comment section about it.
Mhm.
Some are sort of common points and questions that people have, some common issues that they have, and hopefully we can explore some of those through, and then we can go into a general conversation later on about some of the other points around it and some of the things which have come out as a result and some recent developments within the sort of YouTube manosphere on the issue. But before we go into any of that, would you like to introduce yourself to people who maybe don't know you, tell them a little bit about yourself and so on?
Uh, I don't really know what to say without divulging, doxable information. I'm a guy. I live in Australia. I guess you would describe me as MGTOW. I sort of run in the same circles as Stardust and CS MGTOW and Barbarossa. So I guess I have a bit of an interest in the human condition, and I think a lot of these things, a lot of the problems that we look at in society today, particularly with gender relations, can ultimately be traced back to biological causes that have evolved over many thousands of years, rather than some of the other hypotheses out there, such as all the women's done got tricked into it by Karl Marx. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where I'm coming at things from.
Excellent. I assume several of the people who are watching this have now just instantly shut the window and been like, "No, I heard the word MGTOW, not interested. Screw this,
Yeah,
done." And hopefully we can pull some of those people back in and be like, "No, all of those terrible things you've heard on the internet,
yeah,
some of them might be true, but they're not true of all of them." And
yeah.
hopefully we're gonna actually put on a good show for this somewhat misunderstood part of the internet.
Mm.
So I think we should leap straight on into some of these questions. Obviously, we're going to do them in an order that makes a little bit of sense. So we're going to look at some of the data-related questions, and then we'll look at some of the other sort of more or less formal questions, I should say, around it. So the
Yeah.
first question, which I sort of want to kick us off with, the OKCupid survey data, which you've used in your video, and I suppose also the Tinder
Hmm.
information as well, comes from a very large sample size. Now, obviously, the sample size that you've used makes it very hard to ignore the pattern that is presented.
Yeah.
However, do you think there's a possibility that this pattern might be skewed by the kinds of people who use dating sites? Basically, do you think there's a possibility that that there might be some discrepancies in the actual attractiveness of these people that lead them to use those sorts of dating sites in the first place? Could it be that actually the 80% of men who are called unattractive on OkCupid and Tinder actually are just 80% unattractive?
I guess that's possible, though that wouldn't account for the discrepancy between the the male side and the female side. So this idea that, you know, only ugly people use internet dating, that doesn't account for the really normalized, when the men, the male appraisal of female attractiveness in the study, it has a very normalized curve to it. So unless it's just only ugly men use it and average and pretty and ugly, like a large array of women use it, there just doesn't seem to be a reason to think that. And I think there's other data outside just the raw Tinder and OKCupid statistics. When I was doing research for that video, I actually stumbled across this article on statisticbrain.com, which covers some online dating statistics, which actually says a woman's online desirability peaks at 21. At 26, women have more online pursuers than men, but by 48, men have twice as many online pursuers as women. So once you actually get past that that age of, I guess, the reproductive age, it flips. The market value flips, and it doesn't really fit this idea of you know, only ugly people use online dating, but it does actually fit the model that MGTOW and PUA guys like Rollo Tomasi have been sort of putting forward for quite some time now about sexual market value over time. The idea that women get their sexual market value from fertility, which is skewed to one end of the age demographic, and then you've got, you know, male attractiveness is largely based on resources, which they obviously don't have to start with and then build up over time.
Interesting. I suppose that sort of leads us on to the next question quite nicely then. The OkCupid data and this Tinder data, again, it seems to have been taken with a rating of attractiveness, but in the OkCupid survey, the attractiveness is based solely on appearance. They're being asked to register only the photographs. The later drawn S-curve chart, however, posits that the OkCupid data is an absolute attractiveness. Now, while physical attractiveness is a large part of what is absolutely attractive about a person, there are other factors that are difficult to link to physical attractiveness, like wealth and personality. Do you think that there's a way to quantify these separate parts? Do they even need to be quantified separately? How could you sort of expand on this or make it more accurate in the future, do you think?
Well, this is one of the main complaints as to, you know, whether or not what was being talked about in the OkCupid study could apply. Like it was a very narrow definition of attractiveness, I guess, and the question of whether or not that could be applied to people outside of internet dating. It was never, when I drew the curve, it was never really supposed to be, this is absolute attractiveness. I simply used the data because, as you said, it was a large sample size that had very good quantified numbers. There's obviously other things that, like, attraction isn't one thing. It's not just looks. And when you look at the things that women find attractive in men past looks, so things like height, wealth, charisma, humor, it's interesting some of the things we see. So I've dug up a few articles for the talk. This one here is quite interesting. It's from the Dailymail, and it says the title of the article is "Time to Stock Up on Cuban Heels, Boys. 70% of women say a man wouldn't stand a chance if he was less than 6 feet tall." So I'll just quote it. "Although men are getting there, slowly but surely, having shot up by 4 inches in the past 100 years, 71% of females still say that the ideal height for a male partner is between 6 feet and 6 feet 6 inches, according to a new poll. And as far as men are concerned, 45% would date a woman taller than them if she would have them." So it's interesting that when we actually start looking past the looks into other areas like physical stature, like height, we still see these same sorts of numbers where close to half of men don't care if the woman's taller than them, but 71% of females are basically looking at the top 15% of men. And you see the same thing with wealth as well. I mean, wealth, there's a lot of articles out there that talk about resource provisioning and the fact that women find wealth attractive. There's very few that actually put a number on, like an actual quantifiable number on it, because obviously then you get the whole, gold digging, people don't want to promote that idea. I did actually quite a while ago find this article on the Courier Mail titled "Man Drought Sees Shortage of Eligible Men as Women Struggle in Dating Game." And the interesting part about that article is that in the very last paragraph, they do actually sort of tell you how that they've come about this term eligibility, or eligible men. So it says there are 1.3 million single women aged 25 to 34 living in Australia. In the same age bracket, however, there are only 86,000 single, heterosexual, well-off or eligible men earning above $60,000 a year. And when you actually do if we assume that there's actually the same number of single men as women, so there are 1.3 million single men, but only 86,000 of them are eligible by this criteria. Those women are essentially looking at the top 6.6%. So when you actually look at all of these different aspects of what could be considered attractive in a male mate, they're always kind of looking at the very apex of men. Obviously, there's other things like you can't. Humor would be a very difficult one to quantify like that. But even with humor, we still see some very clear differences in how men and women not just interpret humor from the opposite sex, but also how humor is interpreted at the neurological level. There are every aspect that we look at and put numbers to it, there are strong differences between men and women.
Okay, so you're saying that when you look at all of these sort of different points, you continually see this similar ratio across multiple
Yeah,
points, where it still seems to be this sort of 80% aiming at the top 20.
yeah, and I mean we could argue all day as to what affect various things like humor. As I said, it's a very hard one to quantify. The wealth one is a hard one to quantify just because people don't like putting numbers to it. But at the end of the day, the proof is really in the pudding. Like if we actually look at our DNA, when we compare like the mitochondrial DNA to Y chromosomal drift, we see that we've had like the generous estimate is that twice as many women have reproduced throughout our evolutionary history as men. So the proof is really in the DNA pudding. And yeah, when you get up to like the Neolithic, when you have socially rich hunters competing with resource-rich farmers, the reproductive ratio, according to the studies, actually skews out to about 17 to 1. So for every 17 women reproducing at that time period, they were doing it with only one man.
Very interesting. Now, I suppose we can pull this onto a different question, isn't it? Because we've obviously just sort of talked about reproduction and how that's sort of quite a big part in all of this. And in that presentation, you brought up a possible link to quite a few societal changes and have linked them, at least chronologically, to the advent of the female contraceptive pill.
Yeah.
Now, in that regard, since the contraceptive pill does seem to be at least chronologically linked to several of these things, do you think that if we were to invent, say, a male pill, we would see another sort of chronologically linked shift, even if not perhaps directly causally related?
Um, I think some things would change. At the moment, if you look at the data, a lot of pregnancies that happen at the moment are still unwanted pregnancies or unintended pregnancies. So they're either mistimed or um, it's was not supposed to happen at all. I think men being able to control their own reproduction would lead to some changes. The depth of those changes, I mean, it's really hard to say. I think women would still more or less hold the reproductive aces. At the end of the day, if you want a kid, you still have to have a womb. And there's also the possibility that such a development, like a male pill, could actually cause some, just as many negative unintended consequences. For all we know, the divorce rate could skyrocket even further. Crime could go up. It's really hard to say. I think it would be overall good. I think the development of a male pill would be a good thing in general. But yeah, it's hard to say exactly what the outcome would be regarding these kind of social statistics.
Interesting. Now, obviously, we're talking here about sort of technological advancements that ultimately then end up having quite a big impact on the sexual market value of both men and women, and how much they have to put in to get out, and what sort of the
Mm,
repercussions of some of those actions are. And
mm,
obviously, once we change some of those things, there does seem to be reasonable evidence that suggests that if you have a slight societal change like that, it does sort of have a knock-on effect later. So what we've seen is increased rates of single parenthood, specifically
yeah.
majoritarily single motherhood, and that has been very objectively linked to lower quality of life for the child in not universally, but in the majority of circumstances. It's been very objectively linked to higher levels of stress in both the child and the mother, higher levels of poverty, which, as we
Mm,
all know, higher levels of poverty leads to higher rates of crime, drug abuse, depression, alcohol abuse, so on and so forth. So what I want to do is I want to sort of look a little bit more at some of these like quite big biological game changers. In this instance, we talked about we've just sort of covered the pill, and you mentioned there that one of the big things is you have to have a womb in order to reproduce.
mm.
So looking at some further game changers, as technology advances and we see other game changers in regards to like sexual marketplace value, things that in some ways you could argue ultimately devalue sex, virtual reality pornography, sex robots, and perhaps even the advent of the artificial womb. Do you think
Mm.
we could see a possible shift towards actual equality in the sexual marketplace? Or do you think the advent of these things would shift in the opposite direction? Perhaps into a world where male sexuality actually became more valued than female sexuality? Or would it continue the shift more in favor of female sexuality than male, do you think?
I don't think it's going to ever shift in the opposite direction. Like things like the artificial womb, for example. I mean, you're talking about incredibly complicated technology, expensive to build, expensive to run and maintain. Like, it doesn't take a lot of effort to get pregnant, I guess. It's a natural biological process that, I mean, hell, rats do it. If rats can do it, we can do it, sort of thing. But trying to do that artificially, I think even if the technology was built and the price could come down, I think it would still be more expensive for a guy to have a baby using the artificial womb than it would a woman getting pregnant naturally. And I think when we look at the types of not just regulation but cost involved in something like IVF today, which to simplify things, I guess IVF is basically a couple of test tubes and a turkey baster and a few follow-up appointments. I mean, we're talking about technology that would have to be it would have to be run for 9 months uninterrupted, and there's the complexity of things like embryonic development, like the hormone levels and stuff. I don't see it being in our immediate future, and when if it arrives, I don't think it would shift the balance. Things like virtual reality porn, I think, will change a few things. I mean, the more realistically those sorts of things can be simulated, possibly the less people will be driven to do stupid things and make stupid decisions by their base biological urges. But yeah, I don't think you'll ever get to a point where the biology between men and women is actually equal from a reproductive standpoint.
Good. That's kind of some interesting points about the artificial womb there. I know that I've sort of addressed similar points on my channel before, sort of addressing some other MGTOW people who say, like, no, it's going to be the game changer, and you look at it and think, well, you have to run this thing for 9 months, it's going to be ridiculously expensive, who's going to foot the bill, and all of that sort of things. And even then coming down to other questions like, do you remember the legal battle that people had to go through just to get, like, single parents to be able to adopt a child, and gay couples to be able to adopt children? Can you imagine the legal battle for a single man to say, I want to have a child by myself?
Well, yeah, I mean, and even the issue of surrogacy at the moment, it seems to be that, I guess, that when you start getting down to the point where even couples are buying babies essentially, or renting wombs, it starts to make people really uncomfortable.
Okay, so we've spoken a little bit here about sort of how biology certainly seems to be part of human attraction, something that is inseparable from it. We have vast amounts of data showing that men are objectively, on aggregate, attracted to certain traits in women. We have similar levels of data that seem to indicate that women are attracted to, again, they have propensity for certain qualities within a man. I find it very interesting that some people are very willing to accept the side that men have a propensity for attractiveness for X, Y, and Z traits in women, youth, symmetrical facial features, clear skin, a certain waist to hip ratio, but then they seem a little bit less eager to accept when we have very similar data, in fact, arguably more data, suggesting that women have an attraction for certain things in men in regards to status, in regards to wealth, in regards to things like that. So one of these questions, which I suppose leads us nicely into the less formal part of this, is if we become aware of these sorts of effects, will we ever actually be able to do anything about it?
My thought is no. In the recent honey badger talk that you had with Dr. Randa McCam, Alison, and Karen, the topic came up a lot about obesity and the obesity epidemic, and Alison sort of was taking the position, and it's actually a fairly common position, the idea that people are ultimately responsible for their own choices, and if only they would stop eating so much and actually take care of their caloric intake, a lot of these problems would start going away. But the studies, even on weight loss, show that when obese people lose a significant amount of body weight, only 20% of them can actually maintain that weight loss over a 12-month period. It's actually like long-term weight loss, based on the data, seems to be almost impossible by sheer willpower and peer pressure. It's certainly there's efficacy to it, where if you exercise and you count calories in and calories out, it's certainly efficacious, but it's not effective in real life. It just doesn't seem to be enough. That this raising awareness and self-determination doesn't seem to be enough to curb the weight problems that our societies are facing. The instincts seem to trump logic every time.
It is interesting that you should mention that, because here in Britain, I don't know how it is in Australia, but we have all manner of public awareness campaigns going on around that sort of thing. We have something called the 5 a Day program, which is
Yeah,
basically the government sticking out loads of posters saying like you must eat at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetables every day. We have
yeah, we have
the
similar
awareness
things. Yeah,
things, which is like, oh, you must get 30 minutes, try to walk for at least 30 minutes or 20 minutes every single day. There's some schools now which are starting to bring in like mile a time clubs sort of thing, where it's like, no, we take the children and we let them run outside before they do anything for either 15 minutes or a mile, and sometimes they'll do it as races and things like that. All this sort of awareness raising about health and fitness and diet and exercise. And yet, despite all of these things, which in some cases are having millions of pounds of public money put into them, the obesity rate still seems to be increasing.
yeah. Yeah, we have the same thing here. And I mean, it's not even just, public awareness raising. People that are obese don't particularly like being obese. And I mean, some of them do try to change, but yeah, only 20% of them succeed over a long-term period of 12 months. There just seems to be some things that you can't logic people out of their own biology. I think there are solutions. Whether or not those solutions are good or not is another question. In the same talk, for example, Alison Tiemann said that if we can fix the obesity problem, then surely, if we can fix the weight loss, the obesity problem, surely we can fix the problem of gynocentrism. If we can teach people to regulate their caloric intake, we can teach people to, deal with their, horny emotions or whatever. The problem is there are sheer willpower doesn't seem to be enough. So the question becomes, what is the solution? Should we be looking at medical solutions like gastrointestinal bypass, for example, some type of medicine like a pill, or do we actually want to look at genetically engineering people? But there are consequences to it, I think, where, I mean, we're talking about some very fundamental instincts, not just to humans, but all biological animals. And the question sort of becomes, how much of that can you reasonably strip away without causing deficits elsewhere? For example, if we were going to talk about like augmenting our biology to do this, say we have a scale, right? On one end, you've got Pepe Le Pew chasing Penelope Cat, who, he's just making bad choice after bad choice because he can't keep it in his pants. And then at the other end of that scale, you've kind of got the Cybermen from Doctor Who, just completely augmented humans where all of that unnecessary emotional, irrational drives have been stripped out. How far along that scale do you want to go to solve these problems? I don't know what the solution is. I guess it's up to every person to decide that for themselves. This is actually an area that me and Stardust disagree on quite a bit. His situation, or his position, is essentially, Doctor Who Cyberman, sign me up. I'd be very uncomfortable with such a thing, and I suspect most other people would as well.
Seems reasonable to. In some cases, I suppose it eventually becomes the argument for transhumanism, which I think then leads us quite nicely on to The good old evolutionary red herring, which Stardust has addressed, I've addressed, I think you've addressed. Like, so many people who deal with evolutionary psychology and biopsychology address this probably every goddamn day. Biological determinism.
Mm.
Because we have the biological faculties, we get people who say they inevitably build the sort of straw man arguments. No, you say, well, there appears to be a propensity for XYZ thing to be considered attractive by this person in the opposite. To which we
Yeah.
then get the whole, oh, so you're saying women are biologically programmed to be gold diggers.
Yeah, which I mean, I don't think that. I think it's just women have certain. There are certain evolved strategies that are beneficial for women to pass on their genes, and the same thing is true of men. Like men obviously look for things like, as you said, hip to waist ratio. Stardust actually did a really interesting video, probably a couple of months now. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it was called assortative mating as a delimitive factor in male ideological behavior. And essentially he was talking about the biology, the reproductive strategies behind why men prefer women with the same eye color as them, for example, because it's actually a method of an unconscious method of paternity assurance. And he basically linked that idea to, you know, some of the motivations behind white nationalist movements and stuff. It's not, none of this is essentially saying, you know, picking someone with with blue eyes is bad, or picking a husband that's got more money is a bad thing. They're just basically mating strategies that, you know, have evolved because they work. It's not necessarily passing moral judgment on anyone to examine these things.
Yeah, it does seem to be that the first sort of hurdle is just actually examining things and making the
Mm.
observation, but it does seem that there are some people who are becoming increasingly unwilling to even make that observation.
Mm. Well, I mean, a good example, I guess, would be when Sargon was having that talk with Spinosaurus and Stardust the other week, and Sargon was trying to impress the idea that we shouldn't be talking about gynocentrism. We should be talking about anti-egalitarianism. The problem that I have with that is that anti-egalitarianism doesn't tell me why, for like gene propagation, a praying mantis is worth more as a protein supplement after copulation. It doesn't tell me why female lions like male lions with darker manes. Egalitarianism just doesn't exist in nature. Nature's kind of eat or be eaten, and that's the environment we evolved in. And I mean, frankly, egalitarianism doesn't even exist in most societies. I mean, civilization's been around for 6,000 years, and it's only in sort of like the 1960s that we started to see, you know, some Western nations implementing equal rights legislation. Trying to frame things in terms of anti-egalitarianism doesn't really tell us anything about the underlying causes to these problems.
Okay, so in regards to like this sort of egalitarian anti-egalitarianism, we're sort of looking at this idea that I suppose it's somewhat an uncomfortable truth for people who do think of themselves as egalitarians, because we don't like to look at people and say that there are some people who are just better than others, because even when you phrase it like that, you think, oh, that sounds like a real dick thing to say. But
Mm,
there is this sort of fundamental unavoidable truth that people are not the same.
yeah.
And so it doesn't really seem surprising that there are some people who are just naturally better at certain tasks than others. Like,
Well,
you don't, it doesn't seem to be very contentious when you have two people and you say, like, even like people who have never done a certain task before, like just say
Mm.
one person is like really good at say throwing darts even though they've never thrown darts before, and you can say like, oh, there might be some genetic faculty that gives you better hand-eye coordination on
Mm.
average than someone else. There will probably be social elements to it as well, like maybe you've picked up a similar skill that allows you better depth perception or better spatial awareness, but there might be some other faculty to it too. Now, something like that doesn't seem very controversial, and
No.
no one seems to be suggesting that these sort of ideas must be applied, as the famous straw man is, across racial groups or any such nonsense like that. That sort of seems to be where this leads. People say like, oh,
Yeah.
well, if you're
Race
saying that
realism,
there,
basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like if you're
But
saying that there is some genetic faculty to it, isn't that just going to be like something that people use to basically play the race card?
here's the thing: people don't have a problem with that when it comes to like sporting events. Like you guys had the London Marathon a couple of months ago, and I was looking at the results of that, and both the men and women's division was like Kenyan, Ethiopian, Kenyan. Of the top 10 males and top 10 females, I think 17 of them were East African. People, and I think that actually, it's kind of like this below the neck fallacy where people think evolution only happens below the neck, and I think that's possibly highlighted in that whole statement of don't talk about gynocentrism, talk about anti-egalitarianism, because I think it's this idea that if we frame it in terms of things like philosophical concepts like egalitarianism rather than the raw instincts that have evolved in nature. If we frame it in those terms, it's kind of PC because it all exists as a concept rather than different brain differences. I think it's interesting. I've noticed it quite a bit when I sort of was peripherally, well, not even peripherally. I'd spent quite a bit of time in the online atheist community before Elevator Gate. And leading up to that, it was actually really interesting because all of these people that were very gung-ho about evolutionary biology suddenly had this huge problem when we started talking about things like altruism and how that would have evolved. Because when you go from evolutionary biology to evolutionary psychology, the focus seems to shift between what we are, which is bipedal hairless apes, to who we are. And I think people are profoundly uncomfortable being told who they are and that they have certain... I mean, you're familiar with the term cognitive dissonance, yeah?
Yes.
Where, if somebody has done the wrong thing, for example, they will in their own head create huge logical loops and stuff to try and justify what they've done, because in their head they can't rationalize the fact that they've actually done something wrong. It's not part of their it doesn't fit with their perception of themselves. So they have to try and logic around the fact that they've done this wrong thing to somebody else or something.
So how would that sort of be applied to this concept of evolution supposedly stopping at the neck? What would be that sort of what would be, say, an example of that cognitive dissonance that someone might display?
Well, I would have thought that the whole anti-egalitarianism thing would be one, but there just seems to be this. It's like I said before about like Alison's stance that obesity is something that you control, that you can control, and I guess we can kind of look at it and say, yeah, it is. I mean, you could stop shoveling chocolate cake into your mouth, and I think that's a satisfying position to take because you've got somebody to blame. But yeah, I mean, as soon as we start talking about the actual statistics involved with the success of weight loss long term, we lose a lot of self-control, and I don't think people like that. They're happier clinging on to these ideas that it's all down to personal choice. Like they're happier believing in that, even if the data doesn't actually back it up.
Now, it's interesting that you talk about free choice here, or this what in evolutionary psychology terms seems to now be becoming this sort of illusion of free will. We'll come to that a little bit shortly. People often like to throw out this free will argument. It's the free will meme. I can
Mm.
choose to do whatever I want to do. It's like, yes, you can, but something that a lot of people don't seem to realize is that even free will is explained from as a faculty of biology, that your ability to think in the abstract, your ability to consider the fact that your actions can have a consequence, the idea that you are able to sort of know that if I take, say, this chocolate bar and I don't pay for it, there are multiple outcomes. One outcome,
Mm.
I get caught, I get fined, sent to prison, whatever. The other outcome, I get away with it, I get something for free, but then I know I've deprived someone of something that was theirs unjustly. Your ability to conceptualize all of these things, that is what free will is. And ultimately, that is a faculty of the biology of being human. Humans evolved as a social species. You couldn't
Yeah.
have these faculties and still be a social species. It wouldn't work. If you removed this ability to think in abstract terms and to think in terms of your impact on someone else within your group, you wouldn't be a social species at all.
Mm.
It couldn't happen. And I think that leads us quite nicely into a study that you were actually talking about before we started recording this, about supposed free will and some rather interesting brain scans.
Yeah, well, this was actually a study. It was from a really interesting episode of Horizon titled "The Secret You," where the host of this particular episode, Marcus de Sartoy, kind of went on a bit of a journey to find out what the current state of neuroscience was and how the consciousness and free will fitted into that. And there was some really interesting parts in it where they put him in a functional MRI scanner and ask him to make arbitrary left or right decisions. And by looking at his brain, they were actually able to decipher what his choice was going to be a full 6 seconds before he consciously came to that decision himself, like at the conscious level. And it's scary stuff when you think about it, that somebody can look inside your brain and know what you're going to do 6 seconds before you do. But it's the interesting thing, or equally interesting, was that the scientist afterwards was explaining to de Sartoy that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have no consciousness and you're just an automaton robot, but it does mean that consciousness, what we call consciousness, is really the end product of a holistic, like the holistic process of the brain, and some of that is logic happening at the conscious level, mixed with many different subconscious processes. So, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there are some very low-lying processes in the brain that drive various things that we do that we don't have a lot of control over, and there is sort of they can actually be quantified to some degree.
It is an interesting thing to consider, and I suppose in some ways maybe either retroactively that someone has noticed this beforehand, or by pure coincidence, I suppose it lends some credence to that old phrase that within the first 5 seconds of meeting you, a woman knows whether or not she wants to fuck you.
Yeah, well, I mean that's a lot of other things going on as well. I mean, as some of the things that have been mentioned before, height, looks, even wealth can be signified through clothes, whether you're wearing a Rolex. There's a lot of these signifiers that you can actually tell about a person in the first 5 seconds. And I'd say the same is true for men. Like, men can pretty much size up a woman in the first 5 seconds, as you said, hip to weight ratio, clear skin, good hair. These are all things that you can tell about a person before they even open their mouth.
And what is interesting, and I suppose this again comes back to the people who will attempt to sort of deny any of this, these sorts of things that we look at and constantly observe, what makes them most compelling is the fact that they're cross-cultural, they're
Yeah,
cross-ethnic groups, they're cross-economic models, they're
yeah,
cross-political models. You know, we've seen
mm,
patterns of, I suppose the most contentious one that's come up recently is the concept of hypergamy. Not
yeah,
in the sort of stricter definition sense of women marrying up, but in simply the propensity for hypergamous behavior. Just the idea that women are
yeah,
always looking to um, sort of date up
yeah.
or
Well,
just to go up the chain, and it's something that we've
it's
seen. It's observable in America. We've got studies from China and Hong Kong, so we've gone from
yeah.
capitalist to communist. We've seen it from those studies that you cited, even in your video from or was it from Africa, from a
Uh, I
non-capitalist,
think that
non
they were actually South American, I
South
think.
American.
But I mean, my probably what I'm most familiar with is Australian Aboriginal culture. But that's again, very polygynous, same sort of thing, communistic, polygynous, um, and yeah, I mean, you see it all the way across those different groups. And I mean, it's not just how these relationships are formed in the first place. There is actually a component of how they are maintained long term. Like there's that Forbes article that actually talks about this study long term. It was like a 25-year study which shows that as soon as the woman starts bringing in 60% of the household income, the couple is something like 40% more likely to get divorced in any given year. So money obviously is a component even in the maintenance of relationships once they're formed.
That is quite an interesting one. I mean, what that certainly seems to suggest. Again, we're not going to state as absolutes or say as a rule this applies to everyone, because again, this is from the sort of evolutionary psychology approach that we look at these things, we're looking at
Mm.
propensity. But that sort of seems to be a very interesting point. Like, you know, this idea that resource provision and looking up is not necessarily something that's going to end even once
Mm.
a stable relationship has been formed, or what you'd
Yeah,
think would be a stable relationship. So
and
it raises the
th-
interesting sorts of questions like, can things like emotional provision ever overtake that?
well, I don't really know, but I mean, there's problems with I don't know a problem, but without, I mean, you could talk about emotional provisioning in a second, but I mean, it also has some fairly big implications for the legal structures that build up around these different these different statistics. Like for example, I know, again going back to the Sargon talk with Spinosaurus, there was a part in it where he's talking about, oh well, men are interested in these things too. Like, if a you know if a man gets divorced, he's not going to marry down. He's going to try and get a younger second wife. And whilst that's true, the problem is that young playgirl bunny, or whatever you call them, playmates, playboy playmates, they're not legal tender. Like when a court basically looks at the relationship and determines the value of the relationship and divides up assets and things like that, it all comes down to money. So it's one of those things where I think, and you're never going to see it otherwise. I mean, how else could it possibly work? You can't award a younger wife to a man when he gets divorced. But it's one of these things where, just from the nature of our economic system and the things that men and women are going to be interested in, some things like divorce are always going to be inherently, in favor of women. And there's probably other things like, I think the workforce is, as you were saying before, like, you have these, what happens if two people have never done a task before, but one of them has better spatial awareness skills. It's fairly well established that men are better at, rotating objects and stuff in their head. They have better spatial awareness than women have on aggregate. So, for example, I don't think you're ever going to see I don't think you're ever going to see women taking up higher paid jobs like engineering at the same rate that men will. There are biological differences even in our how well we can perform certain tasks like engineering. There was actually another article. I've kind of been skipping over and back and forth on things a bit. There was another article I actually dug up regarding height. This one's pretty interesting. It's from Malcolm Gladwell, and it's titled "Why Do We Love Tall Men?" In this, he says, in the US population, about 14.5% of all men are 6 feet or over. Among CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that number is 58%. Even more striking, in the general American population, 3.9% of adult men are 6 foot 2 inches or taller. Among my CEO sample, 30% were 6 foot 2 or taller. So there's reasons for that. I mean, from both sides, tall men, physical stature, kind of, there's almost like an inherent biological authority to that kind of stature. And there's also the thing that if you're taller, you've got more, reproductive and growth hormones. You have a higher propensity to take risks, which is necessary in that kind of job. So I think there's a lot of implications across, the legal system, the social system, like just how individuals treat each other in a relationship. And I think a lot of it can be traced back to the underlying biology. And I think a lot of the understanding gets lost if we don't sort of look at these things from the root causes.
Now, I suppose this raises a very interesting question. It's something which I've spoken to Stardust about, actually, both privately and publicly. Given that these sorts of patterns are quite obviously emergent, and that they do seem to come from some sort of base biological origin. Now, obviously, in this instance, we've spoken about things that result in physical differences. We've covered things that might result in mental differences as a result of basic just genetic building blocks of what you're constructed out of. Now, again, we have to put the disclaimer in because this is the internet. We're not saying it's all biology. Of course, culture, surroundings, and all of that stuff has an influence, but you can only ever influence what was there to start with. What was there to start with isn't changeable. Do you think that these sorts of observations can be used to give any sort of credence to some of the more extreme social justice suggestions that we've seen? This idea that because, say, one population, say men, have a propensity for higher muscle density, greater aerobic capacity, things like that, that can then be used, or should then be used, as a means of, say, keeping standards required for men higher than for women in, say, regards to things like armed forces application. We know that, like, universally men must always excel. Like the men's sort of lowest entrance criteria is the same as the female's absolute highest in a lot of cases. Do you think that is in some ways going to be used, or could be used, to then justify that sort of thing? I know one of the points that I've made before, and it's one which I don't sort of like making, but it's kind of a rational conclusion from this. We have, say, for example, in some Western countries, there is like a sort of grading system, a tiering system, and it's done purely on ethnicity, whereby basically if you're Asian, you sort of lose 5 points from your test scores because, you need to level the playing field. White people get kind of nothing, but if you're black, then you get like bonus 5 points just added on to sort of try and bring everyone to a level playing field. Now, currently, those sorts of programs are being done with no real scientific backing, or very little scientific backing. It's being applied to the nonsense pseudo-scientific concept of race, which is an absurdity. We know genetic populations exist, but genetic populations are not races. These are two sort of totally different things. You can have depending on what genes you're measuring it by, you can have people from different racial groups in the same
Mm.
genetic population, depending on what you're
Yeah.
looking at. Do you
Mm.
think that all of that put together, if we were to start going down this, could we use that to start justifying those sorts of programs? And if we did, would we want to? Because at that
I
point, you're sort of looking and saying, well, no, if this person has an objective disadvantage. Could we then
well,
use that to bring them up? And then should we?
as I said, I think this is all very much sort of a below the neck fallacy where these things are only kind of being implemented in areas of job performance and intelligence and things like that, like more abstract concepts. You don't see these same social justice warriors complaining that there's too many black people in the NBA. I mean, African Americans make up 75% of the NBA because their genetics makes them better at that sport. And I think it's going to be one of those things where, with the CEOs, for example, I think you can push all you want, but in a private business like that, people are going to want to elect or hire the best CEO that they possibly can. I just don't see. I don't know. Maybe they will do it, and you'll have to see a few companies basically get run into the ground through social justice mismanagement before people come to the realization that it's really not a good idea. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of meritocracy myself. I think that people should be judged on their merits rather than their gender or their skin color or whatever those merits may be. I'm sure yeah, I mean, there's things that different people are good at. I don't see the purpose of forcing equal outcomes. I mean, the irony is, I mean, you're familiar with the gender equality paradox, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's the
I mean,
Norwegian one, isn't it? Where you give people loads of
yeah,
choice, but they end up partitioning themselves anyway.
yeah. Well, it's not the partitioning themselves anyway. You actually see a wider between jobs like nursing and engineering. You actually see a wider gap. The more egalitarian the country is, you see a wider gap than you would in places like India and China. Because in India and China, people basically they're forced to basically, this is the job available, you have to do it, otherwise you don't get paid. Whereas in Norway, where you're completely free to choose whatever you want, the gender preferences are actually free to do what they naturally would do, and you see those types of careers get wider and wider. So I think it's one of those things where I've always looked at it, and just from the standpoint, like ignoring all the other things involved, I've always thought from the individual level, is forcing people into careers that they wouldn't otherwise do to fill quotas, is that actually going to make the individuals happy? I would tend to think that overall that kind of approach is not only is it bad for the overall field of engineering or whatever we're talking about, but I think it's probably pretty bad for the individuals who are being forced into these positions as well.
That does certainly seem to bear out in reality. Certainly, we are increasingly seeing articles and studies coming out that are talking about how women are becoming more stressed. They're getting higher rates of like cardiovascular disease and stress-related problems, and it's interesting that this sort of seems to coincide with their increasing uptake into the workforce and
Yeah,
all of
I think
those sorts of things.
there was one study, wasn't there, that basically said it's like the last few decades has been the first time that it's been measured where women on aggregate have basically self-reported being less happy than men.
Yeah, that doesn't really surprise me, frankly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I don't know what the solution to it all is. I'm just looking at it, and I mean, I just look at all these different things. The weight loss statistics, preferences with height and wealth and looks and humor, the genetics, things that happen cross species, like, cross culturally, cross species. Even our taste, the difference in taste between male and female hobbies. Like they say, women make up 50% of video gamers these days, but they're playing a very different style of video games to what men are. They're sort of more interested in puzzle-solving games, whereas men are more interested in competitive games. I think really, really hard in-depth strategy games like EVE Online, I think, is 94% male player base. But I look at all of these things, and to me, I just see like this big interconnected web of data that, all points to one, or points to you kind of get it, and it's starting to, when you piece all of these different data points together, you start to get a more holistic picture of the human condition, especially as it relates to men and women. And I think it's one of the problems with the guys that make all of these response videos, where they'll basically, they'll take a video like mine and they'll play a 5-second clip of it where I'm saying, taking Tinder and OKCupid stats, and they'll say, oh, well, you can't necessarily, extrapolate these OKCupid stats to the rest of the population. And that's kind of as deep as they go into it. Like, I really think people need to start looking more deeply, taking a step back and looking at all of this interconnected data as a whole, because it all kind of links together. And I think, it's undeniable some of the trends that are happening across all these different data points.
I suppose then that leads us on to the inevitable accusation, which I would imagine that you've probably been subject to yourself in this, that people will just say, well, the reason that you're looking at this is because you're just cherry-picking, even though it's kind of the only information that we actually have, but they'll still level that accusation anyway.
Honestly, I'm not trying to cherry pick. Like I said, you look at all of these different data points. You look at anything that where it comes down to things that men and women find attractive in each other, and every time it is studied, we see a marked difference. Every time it can be quantified, you see these similar sorts of numbers where 71% of females prefer the top 15% of men as far as height is concerned. I'm not trying to cherry pick. It just seems to be what the overwhelming data shows. And I'm not saying that I'm 100% right. I'm just trying to come up with the best model to explain all of this data. And it just seems to be that, the evolutionary psychology, in my opinion at least, is a much better model to explain all of these differences than Karl Marx, cultural Marxism done it.
It does certainly seem so. So I suppose the only place to go from here, apart from back to the free will argument, which we've already kind of pointed out why that's erroneous and ridiculous, I suppose we have to come to the point that it all sounds a little bit defeatist, doesn't it? That, this idea that can we do something? Should we even try? What? I suppose this is again something which Sargon brought up in his stream with Stardust and Spino. He just said, like, well, okay, even if we know all of this, what are we going to do about it? Is there even anything we can do, or should we try? Or is, as G.I. Joe would say, knowing half the battle? Or is it indeed knowing is the only part of the battle? Can we even do anything? I suppose Stardust even pointed out in that you have to accept that a potential hypothesis of this is that we can do nothing.
Yeah. I think, as I said, I think there are things that can be done. It's just whether or not the cure is worse than the ailment. For example, Alison Tiemann was saying, surely if we can fix the obesity problem, we could fix, gynocentrism. Well, here's an idea: chemical castration. That would solve the problem. I don't think it's a good solution. That was the whole point of eunuchs back in the days of yore, right? They cut off the guy's junk, and theoretically he would operate within the king's court without being susceptible to feminine wiles. I mean, it's a solution. I don't think it's a good solution, which is kind of why I was saying before, where you've got the scale of complete human irrationality on one end, you know, Pepe Le Pew, and on the other end you've got the Doctor Who Cybermen. Like, we're talking about some very fundamental inherent aspects of not just humanity but biology. How much of that can we reasonably strip away and remain human? And I think it's going to be one of those things where as these things get raised, they will naturally sort of solve themselves in a way that, like if you look at the success of the birth control pill, for example, that was a medical augmentation that actually allowed people to indulge in their base desires even more than what they were already doing. And I think that's part of the reason it's so successful. You don't see guys going to their local GP and being like, I don't like I can't get a girlfriend and I don't like these feelings of loneliness, and, you know, I need an outlet for sexual energy that I can't get. Tell me about chemical castration. Like, that doesn't happen. And I think part of the reason is that people, whatever solutions we come up with, and I'm talking like medical, genetic, surgical, I think they are going to have to be in line with our innate preferences to begin with. It's like you said, I mean, you could do it from the standpoint of authoritarians. So, you know, cyber controller starts rounding up the people and turning them into Cybermen against their will. But I think if we don't go down that path, I think as new technologies are developed, the ones that are useful will be voluntarily taken up. And I think, the ones that aren't so good, people aren't going to want them.
Definitely an interesting thing to consider. I suppose then we're looking at, is the only way out of this, and assuming that this is, of course, a problem. I mean, that is something that people haven't, I think, necessarily aren't willing to put on the table, this idea that this stuff isn't actually a problem. Like, do we even have to change it? Can we just build a society around this? Do we have to treat everything equally, and so on and so forth?
Well, this is one of the big issues that I've been thinking about lately, where when you think about, is it a problem and what sort of society would get built up around it? So, like, if we actually look at the environment that humans have actually evolved to operate in, so like civilization's only been here for 6,000 years. Humans are a lot older than that, and the environment that we evolved to operate in, both individually and socially, was not civilization. It's funny, you see these guys, like the traditional conservatives in particular, they look at the last 150 years and they're like, oh my God, the sky is falling. Even since the last 50 years, like since the end of World War II, they've just seen this massive decline of the nuclear family, and they just, you know, everything's falling apart. The nuclear family is a relatively recent thing. I mean, when we actually start looking at hunter-gatherer tribes, which is what we, you know, spent most of our evolutionary history since, you know, the start of humanity living as, we see some fairly consistent things. So they share resources. They can't afford to have sort of individual possessions and property. What belongs to you sort of belongs to the whole tribe. Another thing that's really interesting about them is they actually do kind of have a women and children welfare system. The men go off to hunt. The children are actually, in almost every hunter-gatherer culture you have, the children are looked after by the female side of the camp. And then when they're old enough, they go through like a coming of age or like rite of passage ritual, and they join the boys join the male side of the camp. And I've sort of been wondering if that's the natural state of things. Once you have an industrial revolution where you, I guess, collectivize like labor and resources are now no longer dependent on an individual man kind of waving a hammer around. You're mass producing it on a scale that can be, collectively owned, collectively taxed. It's interesting that as soon as that's happened, you sort of start to see a rise of a welfare state where we are going back to that model where the men are doing the work and the women are sort of raising the kids. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah. But what I find really interesting about that is how, as that process happens, it seems that the contribution of the males becomes sort of less and less appreciated, as it were. That might have something to do with the fact that it's being, you can't put a single face to it. It might not be that it's not appreciated. It might just be that it becomes kind of a faceless thing that just gets done for you. It's like I'm sitting here at my computer. I have no idea which guy built all of this stuff, but I'm sure if I met him, I'd say thanks, but I have no idea of knowing. Or it might just be part
Alan
of
Turing, shake that man's hand.
Exactly. It also might just be something to do with the increasing mechanization as well.
Well, I mean, it is a good point. I guess, like back in the days of hunter-gathering, the men would come back with game that they'd killed, and they'd basically, skin it and put it on the fire for you. You'd actually see that was an interaction that was happening. Whereas now, I guess the workforce is taxed, and then single mothers receive a sort of they don't even receive a check anymore. It just gets automatically debited into an account. So I guess that's an interesting point. But yeah, I always wonder, like when you look at the way we're actually kind of we're wired through evolution, where the children were collectively raised by the female side of the camp. The fact that that's essentially what's happening now, I wonder if we're just kind of going back to the guys, the tradcons are like, oh God, everything's falling apart. But it was actually the opposite, that the unnatural thing was civilization, and now we're kind of going back to the model that we'd essentially evolved to operate in.
It's certainly an interesting way of looking at it, definitely.
Yeah. Again, disclaimer, I'm not saying that's a good thing. As a single guy, I don't particularly like that model. I'm just, as a hypothetical, does it match, what we see, how we see hunter-gatherers operate?
Yeah, I suppose this is, again, I hate the internet sometimes, because it feels like even if you just want to poke around in a hypothetical something, someone's always going to take it as being like, oh my God, you're endorsing this 100% and saying, no, I'm just experimenting.
Colttaine's endorsing the welfare state.
Yeah, it's like, no, I'm making observations. I'm looking at it. It doesn't, it's no moral judgment. That seems to be a wonderful thing. And it comes back to this, like, oh, are you saying women are genetically programmed to be girls? No, there's no moral judgment on any of this at all. You're saying they only want to sleep up and men want to fuck teenage girls. Like, there's no moral judgment. It's just observations of propensity.
Yeah. And I guess, this is one of those things where I actually look at, even from that standpoint, I have to wonder about Sargon's suggestion about anti-egalitarianism, where, if you watch that video of Stardust's, it really does kind of give you an insight into why the white nationalist movement is predominantly made of men, predominantly aged sort of 18 to 40 years old. And it is, if you actually look at the racial preferences that happen through mating. White nationalism is really a reproductive movement, right? It's like, white men need to marry white women, don't be a race traitor or whatever. And if you do take it from the standpoint that women actually don't, in the studies that have been done, women don't seem to show a strong racial preference. They don't care because maternity is assured. If she gives birth, that's her kid. Paternity assurance is a lot harder, where it actually makes sense. If you're a blue-eyed guy, you want to marry a blue-eyed girl because, if you marry a brown-eyed girl and you have a brown-eyed kid, But if you marry a blue-eyed girl and she has a brown-eyed kid, then you'd be like, well, there's something suspect going on, right? But I think that kind of, it's not even necessarily that you can take that information and do something with it, but I just think ultimately that's, to me at least, that's a lot more useful information to know than simply getting up in their face and calling them an anti-egalitarian racist. Like it doesn't tell me anything about the underlying causes of why they've taken this position and why other people like the white women aren't taking that same position. Like
Well,
there's...
yeah, it certainly makes sense from the concept of sort of mate competition and mate guarding, which seem
Yeah.
to be behaviors which are exhibited in humans to some degree. I believe C.S. MGTOW addressed this not all that long ago in one of his videos, where he actually spoke about like mate competition and mate guarding in
Yeah.
humans, and how it's not necessarily like physical. We've just had sex. I'm now going to stand here and make sure no one goes near you. It can be more subtle things like, the ring on the finger
Holding
saying,
hands, yeah.
yeah, like no, it's like we're together. No one else sort of try anything.
Yeah.
It does sort of make sense that this concept of some sort of mate guarding or some sort of socialized mate guarding is a thing, which
Yeah.
I'd like to sort of side us on to one topic here as a sort of final topic, because time is getting on a little bit, and I'm going to pull us onto feminism's favorite concept, patriarchy, because we have this or we seem to have a sort of social concept of mate guarding that seems to be somewhat genetically informed. Guys like to know that the kids they're looking after are theirs, and that doesn't
Yeah.
seem to be an unreasonable thing at all. Obviously, we've got the example there that, if you've got blue eyes, having a blue-eyed mate is a semi way of ensuring that. Obviously, if you're both heterozygous, you can still have a brown-eyed kid.
Yeah, I think it's like there's like a 25% chance.
The chance of
But
getting a blue-eyed kid if you've got that, but if one is homozygous, the other's heterozygous, it's a kind of assurance. It's not a really good one, but I suppose you're probably using other traits as well.
Well, there's a lot of other traits, but the fact is that when the studies do actually show that brown-eyed men don't show a preference, women don't show a preference at all, but when shown random images of women, so that the study was that the subjects were shown a whole bunch of different women, and some of them had their eyes. So they were shown like 20 women, and half of them had like they'd had their eyes altered, so half of them were blue and half of them were brown, regardless of what their rest of their natural features were. And the blue-eyed men did actually show a slight preference for the blue-eyed women. So there was actually a statistically significant preference for blue-eyed men that wasn't present in brown-eyed men or the women.
Which is interesting, and like I said, I'm gonna bring this on to the feminist concept of patriarchy, which is quite an interesting one. And I suppose it also ties into the Neolithic hypergamy that we've mentioned a little bit earlier. This sort of massively skewed rate of breeding that seems to have happened throughout a lot of human history. Is it not then necessarily too far-fetched to think or to hypothesize, again, I don't want to say as an absolute or anything like that, that these concepts of like patriarchal societies where men do a lot of the labor, or they do the harder labor, as a result they gain more political power, more social power than the women, but at the same time women with the lesser social power also have a lot less social responsibility. So in essence, the men are able to defend the women and they are expected to, whereas the women are not. And again, this is something that was brought up on the honey badger thing about how you can have like Middle Eastern very, very strict men control everything, women do nothing, but it's still explained within the framework of gynocentrism.
Yeah.
Like that. But could it not then be too far-fetched to hypothesize that then patriarchy is I don't like the term patriarchy, but that there is some sort of societal layout like that, some sort of I would say a gentleman's agreement, but it's not only a gentleman's agreement because it's not only between men. It's sort of between men and women and men and men and women and women that we will societally come up with an institution like marriage that kind of forces an even mate distribution throughout society. Is it not unreasonable, I would say, to hypothesize that this is something that came about to stop this unfair split happening? Do you think that there's a possibility that that could have been a conscious thing, or was it something that merely happened as a result of the agricultural revolution and resources just being more and everywhere?
I think it's one of the. I think it's emergent. I don't think it was like a planned conscious. I don't think it was by design. One of the things when you start going from that communistic system. So, I mean, with the communistic system in hunter-gatherers, for example, you have the top tribesmen are polygynous, and they have multiple wives. A lot of the people in those tribes are monogamous. Some people, don't reproduce at all. But it's one of those things where paternal investment, it's important, but at the same time, given the structure, the fact that you're all sharing resources and the women are collectively raising the children. Like, for example, in Australian and Aboriginal languages, they actually don't differentiate between direct offspring and nieces and nephews. So like a man will refer to every single child in the generation below him as son or daughter. And it goes the reverse as well. Like children will actually call their auntie mother and their uncle's father. But I mean, once you throw away that kind of communistic system where children are collectively raised and resources are shared for like a fiat money system where you work and you have a fixed income and you have to live on that, I think it was a more just a point of pragmatism where a single man could only support a single woman. And I mean, to the extent that monogamy again did exist in the rise of civilization, you look at Rome and Greek and stuff, the wealthier people, I mean, they had a wife, but they also had a stable of concubines. I think it was much more. I don't think it was by design. I guess you could say, there are there were some institutions that took that model and then tried to formalize it and rigidly enforce it on people, like the church did. But the actual rise of that kind of monogamous marriage itself, I think it was much more of a natural emergent thing, just on the basis of how a fiat money economy system works.
Interesting stuff. I think we've covered quite a wide variety of things here. Hopefully, we've addressed some of the criticisms around that presentation that was hosted up a few months ago. I'm glad that we've finally been able to cover this, and I think we've taken this to sort of some very, very interesting places. A lot of interesting sort of hypotheticals have been covered today. So I think as we approach the 2-hour mark, it might be a good time to wind down. Do you have any sort of final thoughts, questions, after messages for anyone watching?
Not really. I mean, I was basically going to conclude by saying, just look at all the data: height, wealth, looks, humor, our hobbies, our propensity for religion, the actual DNA data that shows differences, different rates of reproduction between our male ancestors and our female ancestors, what other animals are doing, the pre-civilizational history of hunter-gatherers, like just all of these things, rather than looking at them in individual sort of response videos, try and get a greater understanding of how all of these things are linked together, because I think once you start looking at all of these pieces as a part of a greater whole, yeah, you start to get a much clearer picture of essentially the human condition.
Yep, that is a sentiment that I fully agree with. I think when it comes to this topic, people need to be willing to take a step back and do more of a meta-analysis across multiple studies and sources. You know, we're not going to find ever, I think, a single paper that basically just says, "Hey, biology and behavior." You know, it's not going to happen. The topic
Yeah.
is just too broad for a single paper to ever cover
Yeah.
such a thing.
And even to the extent that single papers do, I mean, obviously, I definitely don't see them as an argument against generalizations, but you are also going to have outliers. Not everyone fits into the middle of the distribution curve. That's why it's called a distribution curve. But it is one of those things where we can learn a lot about ourselves as individuals and as species by honestly looking at how these things happen on average.
Yeah. Everyone likes to think that they are the exception, or claims that the one exception that they know disproves the 99%, but it really doesn't. It
Yeah.
actually fits perfectly into the explanation.
Yeah.
Right, I do believe that is a good point to end it, so I'd like to say thank you, Colttaine, for joining me today. Hopefully it's been informative for everyone watching and enjoyable, and hopefully we will be able to discuss further things in the future, and I'd hope that in the not-too-distant future you would be able to produce some further content expanding
Yeah.
even further on this working hypothesis that you've got, because I think that's something very important to point out to people who have watched that video that I've uploaded on your behalf, or those 3 videos on your channel. This is kind of it's a working hypothesis. It's not a finished 100%, this is how it is. It's a work in progress.
And believe me, there's things that are wrong in it. There's actually one of the videos before I do my next major. I've got a few things planned, but before I do my next major one, I am going to have to make something of an errata video, because there is mistakes in it. Like I said, I'm just trying to. I'm not always right. I'm just trying to come up with the best model to fit the data, and there are things that I get wrong. So yeah, I mean, don't take everything I say as gospel. But yeah.
Well, I believe that is the best way to be. Just be open to the possibility that you can be wrong, and that things, you know, no hypothesis is right the first time. Everything can be refined, everything can be made more accurate, and I think the fact that that is something that you are doing is very, very admirable.
Well, thanks.
Well, someone's got to do the legwork, and, you know,
Yeah.
it's got to be done. And if people are willing to do it and then put it all together into some nice, easy to digest presentations, so much the better.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to end that there. Once again, thank you all for joining us here today. I hope you have enjoyed it, and do please go and check out Colttaine's channel. He has some excellent videos on there. He puts things together with some very, very nice graphical work that makes what's being said a lot easier to understand and digest, and makes it sort of quite user-friendly, especially for people who might be new to that topic.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure, and hopefully, as I said, we can do something like this in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.